TRT World correspondent and pilot himself, Joseph Hayat, joins me now in the studio. What do we know about the last few minutes of this flight, Joseph?
Well, it was effectively in its descent, trying to get onto the instrument approach. So this particular airfield, Yasuj Airfield, is in the middle of a mountainous region, and the aircraft basically direct to a navigational beacon in the centre of the airfield. They then execute what's known as a teardrop approach. It's an approach shape that's the same as a teardrop in shape, and they execute a series of steps of descent. Now, it descended going for around a minimum safety altitude of what is highest peaks of the mountains are 4,700 metres, and the lowest parts of the minimum safe altitude are 3,500 metres. That's the minimum altitude the aircraft cannot safely descend below without impacting terrain. We know the aircraft impacted terrain at around 4,000 metres in elevation. So it was at those final stages of descent, heading onto its approach. We know that there was a cloud base with a minimum, the ceiling of the cloud base, which was overcast, was 2,700 metres. So it was very, very clear that above that altitude, the visibility would have been minimal, and they were more than definitely probably relying upon their instruments executing an instrument approach. So very little awareness outside beyond what's in front of them, a lot of cloud, and they're at a very crucial part of the flight where they're descending and trying to navigate to the approach.
If it's an instrument approach, does that mean the pilot is only taking guidance from the computers on the plane itself, and they themselves are not executing any manual maneuvers? We don't know if there's been any distress calls, so we don't know if the pilot was trying to land the plane at that time without any problems, or if he had problems.
You're absolutely right, no distress call. And at that stage of flight, when we say instrument approach or flying on instruments, they are effectively in control of the aircraft. Now, they can fly it manually, but their focus is on the instruments, the altimeter, the airspeed indicators, or in this case of the ATR, their primary flight displays. These are a series of computers that both pilots have that give them all the critical information on terrain, airspeed, altitude, etc. But I think one thing we need to reiterate is how complex this approach was to execute for any experienced pilot. And if there was any, perhaps, emergency or failure, we don't know yet, but if there was an emergency that they faced or a crisis, that would have added so much extra pressure. The ATR 72 and its sister variant, the 42, are historically known as very safe aircraft, but they're very difficult and challenging to fly, especially if they have an engine failure. But what is coming out of this, what we know, is that the commander, the captain in charge of this particular aircraft in flight, he'd previously landed at that exact airfield a few years prior with an engine failure. So he was experienced. It's just not clear what the cause was for now.
The Associated Press here says that this particular plane was out of service for 7 years. We don't know why it was grounded for 7 years, but overall the aviation industry in Iran has suffered quite heavily. Is that fair to say, because of the sanctions?
It really has. I think, you know, the aspiration and the intention of the engineers is always sincere and in the interest of safety, and nobody doubts that in the industry around the world, of the intentions of engineers. But the sanctions have made it that the parts have been harder to get hold of. And in this case of the ATRs, they had to freeze the deal in the acquisitions they were making. Even today, now the sanctions have been lifted, the Iranian government is struggling to negotiate with Boeing, you know, the largest US manufacturer, because Boeing is demanding money up front, which is very normal in the industry, and they're saying, hey, we're not going to give you millions of dollars, because how do we know we're even going to receive these aircraft if the political situation changes?
If Donald Trump reimposes those sanctions. Joseph Hayat, thanks for coming into the studio.